LCSW to CCP. We're really, truly a unique psychoanalytic training institution. Every institute thinks that they're unique, but we truly are, and you'll find out more about that because we offer flexibility. We're above all non-hierarchical. You already heard that Inbar is a member of the board and Inbar is a candidate. We have representatives from every program, major training program, on our board of directors, and our candidates themselves also help shape our curriculum. And I don't think you can get less hierarchical than that. We're a community of over 300 psychoanalytic colleagues, and we have programs for virtually every phase of one's professional development. And so in that sense, we're really, truly unique. We're open, we're responsive to our community and to the needs of the larger society. And as I said, we're also flexible because we know that you have other lives beyond anything related to analytic training and work, but yet you want something that's substantive, that's deep, that's comprehensive, and has integrity. And so we have a unique blend in doing that. And so I'm very, very pleased that you're here. I want to introduce Zak Mucha, who is a board member and also a recent graduate. And so let me give you a bit of his bio. Zak Mucha, LCSW, is a psychoanalyst in private practice and a board member here at the Chicago Center for Psychoanalysis. He spent 7 years working as a supervisor of an assertive community treatment program, providing 24/7 services to persons suffering from severe psychosis, substance abuse issues, and homelessness. Mucha has worked as a counselor and consultant for U.S. combat veterans undergoing training for digital forensic investigations in child pornography. And he's also currently on the board of the Legislative Drafting Institute for Child Protection in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Before going into the clinical field, Zak has worked as a freelance journalist, truck driver, furniture mover, construction worker, union organizer, and staff member at a juvenile Department of Children and Family Services locked unit. And I might also add, had been on tour as a journalist with a fantastic band, the Mekons. I'm sorry, Zak, I just think it's the greatest thing in the world. He's also the author of Emotional Abuse, a Manual for Self-Defense, a collection of poetry entitled Shadowbox, Shadowbox, a novel, The Heavyweight Champion of Nothing, and the forthcoming Swimming to the Horizon, Crack, Psychosis, and Street Corner Social Work. And with that, I want to turn this over to Zak Mucha. Zak.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, thank you, Alan. You make it sound very good when there's a period where I just couldn't hold a job. So, okay. What I'm going to be reading is a heavy rewrite of the piece I presented on graduating the analytic program last year. There's a couple of you who've heard this in a different form. If we get to something familiar, check your phones, get a drink. It won't be long. All right. The title is Learning How to Learn, the Terror of Not Knowing. We start off with a quote from Donald Meltzer. He wrote, "Every psychoanalytic discovery is a self-revelation, and every paper is an autobiography." So that is the warning. One statement from my analyst, gently offered, stung in the moment. She said, "It's hard to learn when you're the smartest person in the room." This wasn't in reference to the room we shared, but the expectation I carried into every room. I was supposed to know. My analyst's comment opened a possibility regarding my own anxiety of feeling totally lost in psychoanalytic readings, lectures, and classroom discussions. From the start, I jumped in without knowing any better, and the first CCP lecture I attended was Lacanian. I was so angry about how little I understood, I came back for the next one. But my analyst asked about these impossible expectations. Why did I expect to know things I had never been introduced to? Why study anything if it brought nothing new to me, if it didn't change me? I joined this field a bit late, after spending years wanting to be a writer while also doing manual labor to pay the bills. But one thing I wouldn't do was go to school. When I did finally jump into school and social work, I took an intense job. Again, I didn't know any better. Running a community triage unit for severely psychotic adults suffering from all the socioeconomic issues that come along with being at the bottom of the barrel. We had one very psychotic client. I mean, they were all very psychotic, but this man was particularly irreverent, violent, charming, and infuriating. He fought against and sabotaged every intervention, no matter if it was housing, meds, benefits, or food, as oppositional declarations of independence. I really liked him, and he would only accept a clinical relationship if we were like buddies in a cop movie. So he was, from the day I got him out of the hospital, he was Steven Seagal, I was Bruce Willis, and that was how we had to run around the neighborhood. Of course, when he was angry at me, he would defecate on the sidewalk at the front door of the building and scream at the janitor, who was angry also, that it's okay, Zak's secretary is going to clean this up. When he was mad at me, I was not Bruce Willis, I was Zak. And I didn't have a secretary either way. I stayed in that job for 7 years, in part because no one was telling me how to do it. Any supervision was administrative, and any concern the agency had regarding my team was financial or legal. I accepted this absence of clinical oversight and didn't seek any out. Teaching myself was much more acceptable than learning from others, as that demanded an acknowledgement of not knowing and a dependence on someone who might teach me. This progression through CCP, I started off in the fellowship program 14, 15 years ago, has been one of starting off where I was not knowing what I was doing and being totally terrified about it, to now not knowing what I'm doing and being okay with that. On good days in the office, I try to hold 2 quotes in my head. One from Bion, which I'm paraphrasing because I couldn't find it. He said, if you're not a little anxious before every session, you're doing it wrong, or you're in the wrong field. And the other quote is from Bill Veeck, who owned the Chicago White Sox in the 50s and 60s, before baseball became totally corporate. He would go to the games, he'd sit in the bleachers, with the fans. He'd have a beer, he'd take off his shirt, he would take off his leg. He had a wooden leg, and he would use it as an ashtray. And he'd sit and drink with the fans. And during an interview, when he was asked about this, he said, I thought going to a baseball game was supposed to be, fun. So maybe we should always be a little scared and simultaneously somehow trying to enjoy ourselves. When I went into my own analysis, I was terrified of what I didn't know, what I would find out, and where I would end up. When my own therapy shifted into full-on analysis, I acknowledged this goes against every class bias I was raised with, trying to make a joke of my own fear. I had never planned to be an analyst or a psychotherapist. As a kid, I knew of no adults who would discuss their inner lives with a stranger. Such disclosure was forbidden, and therapy itself was a sign of weakness. Or worse, it was something rich people did. By doing this, I was betraying old rules and relationships and definitions of my own self. One friend from way back, hadn't seen him in a long time. When I told him what I was doing, I was a therapist, I had my own office and everything. He looked at me a second and said, "So is everyone who comes to you, are they all court mandated?" I thought he was taking a shot at me. But in his experience, the only way anyone goes to therapy is if a judge says the alternate choice is jail. On the walks to my analyst's office, I sometimes thought of this piece of brutal Slavic humor. It's an old joke. A Russian revolutionary sentenced to death is being led into the forest by two soldiers and a priest. Following the execution, his body is to be buried in an unmarked grave deep in the woods, so others cannot make him a martyr. After hours of walking silently through the snow, the priest turns to the prisoner and says, "You think this is bad. I have to walk back." Positioned as the prisoner or the priest, I was forced to acknowledge the uncanny threat of either position, myself being known or unknown to the other, both displacing me, containing the potential threat of not belonging, not knowing, and me not knowing what I was leaving behind and what I was bringing back. In his book, On Balance, Adam Phillips wrote of the inescapable helplessness of living that demands our involvement with others, and cites Freud's notice that we can begrudge our own helplessness, calling up or recalling the wish for a protective object, provoked by a terror of being unloved. Phillips wrote, "The catastrophe of being a human being is that we are irredeemably helpless creatures, and that means helpless to do anything about our helplessness. We are essentially helpless, and that is the very thing that makes our lives impossible. It is the mark of our own resistance to our helplessness that we deem the ineluctable to be catastrophic, as though anything we don't make for ourselves is bad for us." End quote. Phillips also notes that recognizing our helplessness is a prerequisite for the possibility of a satisfaction in life. As a child with an impossible sense of responsibility, a child who is supposed to know, I interpreted my dread of not knowing to be a class issue, where stepping beyond those boundaries would be an aggression against and a diminishment of those who remained loyal. To stay in one's place becomes a means of protecting others and protecting the group, even if that requires a sacrificing of one's own self. To want to understand those childhood glimpses of the adult world and to not have them explained when I was a child left me desperately wanting to know, and left me reluctant to trust those who might have been able to tell me precisely because they would not. Ashamed to have this want denied, not knowing becomes humiliating. So I decided I would teach myself. If I was supposed to know something, then it did not have to be explained to me, allowing the other to never have to risk exposing their own selves by putting these expectations into words. If there are no secrets, then everything is a potential secret and nothing can be said. Speaking of them becomes proof of not knowing, and not speaking becomes knowing. The child who suspects the house is haunted is certain there is something others are not speaking of, whether they know it or not. Those hauntings, placeholders for the intergenerational and interpersonal family secrets, cannot be discussed or understood. If they are spoken of, the gap between people, the gaps between what we each know, is illuminated. Unrecognized, these ghosts in the nursery follow us, marking off the spaces we cannot think of and we cannot think in. And here you go, Alan. There's a socialist Marxist punk band that when they first started in the 70s, literally could not play their instruments. Over the decades, they've learned. They've never made money or got terribly famous, but to this day, every album they do sounds totally different than the last. Each is an experiment. When asked about this, One of their members said, "What's the point of doing something if we know how it's going to turn out?" I like this. The same person also said rehearsing is for cowards. But one side effect of my own analysis has been that I started writing poetry. This was not like I got hit in the head with a can of peaches and came to and could play piano. I mean, I was always writing, but this was something different. With poems, I didn't know what I wanted to say, but there was a sense of something there I was fumbling around with, and I didn't know how it would turn out. The best sessions, whether I'm laying on the couch or sitting in my chair, are the ones that have me thinking about poems. Not specific lines or authors or structure, but the sense of reading a poem, one that surprises with a juxtaposition or a shift that changes the meaning of the previous lines, rewriting as it moves along. The psychoanalyst Gohar Homayounpour compares analysis to blues music, where the next line always holds the possibility of turning melancholy into mourning, and, quote, the concept that by performing or listening to the blues, one is able to overcome one's sadness, to lose the blues, end quote. The hour, the poem, the song turns into a possible liberation from our loss while we are accepting it. Homayounpour continues, it is precisely that inherent duality of life and death, eros and thanatos, that makes the blues such a joy to listen to. It is not about drowning in it, it is about transforming it, end quote. It is an attempt to find our unending ambivalence, to learn what we are thinking. The poet Charles Simic wrote in an absurd blues, cheering for lone houseflies as the world falls apart. He seemed to hold both Bion and Bill Veeck in mind, and he always reminds me of Bion's O, which, as I understand it, is an acknowledgement of a religious contemplative practice in psychoanalysis, touching on the unknown we circle around and that surrounds us. Bion refers to this understanding as a mystery where we must have, quote, the capacity to have feelings of respect for the unknown, end quote. An almost Buddhist sense where the self is more than just an individual subject and simultaneously not that important at all. Simic comes close to the psychoanalytic process in describing a poem as, quote, an attempt at self-recovery, self-recognition, self-remembering, the marvel of being again. A poem is a piece of the unutterable whole. A 50-minute session that surprises both the therapist and patient becomes a poem in this way, and the arc of a therapeutic relationship becomes an entry into that unutterable whole. Like analysis, poetry is this effort for me of trying to be as precise as possible, adjacent to direct meaning, while not knowing what it is I'm trying to say. That unknown, unformulated thought finds a language that includes, as Donnell Stern says, quote, the experience of all the moments that have come before the present moment. Each moment is rooted in its own history. In other words, in the succession of moments that has preceded it, end quote. And the coming moment has the potential to change the one just past. And each moment becomes this perpetual emergence as the past no longer exists, except as stories we tell ourselves. To not bury the emerging self is the work of analysis. To avoid remaining in those states of non-being, where the blind push of shutting down, of knowing, is noted by Anne Reiner in her book, Beyond and Being. She wrote, we can see in our patients and in ourselves the resistance to life, to knowledge, to feeling, to experiencing. The desire for the death of the self is reflected in an unconscious preference for lies over truth and the decision, often made in the earliest days of life, to live a lie which denies the mind and the existence of an inner life, end quote. This death of the self and the presentation of a false self provides protection from the anxiety provoked by the unknowable world, where the true self is safe from harm, but remains unknown. Conversely, stepping into this groundless space destroys something of the once concrete past and allows something new, as Rollo May summarizes Kierkegaard's actualizing possibilities, which, quote, always involves destroying the status quo, destroying old patterns within oneself, progressively destroying what one has clung to from childhood on, and creating new and original ways of living. If you do not do this, you are refusing to grow, refusing to avail yourself of possibilities. You are shirking your responsibility to yourself, end quote. And just probably not coincidentally, Buddhist Sangha meetings, the monk always ends the last, not prayer, but the last chant. The last line is, "Do not squander your life." Then we all bow. But this creative act of bringing the non-being into being depends on the incorporation of our histories, even as their meanings change. And we can feel the guilt of the destructiveness that May says is a part of all creation. Reiner calls this a battle royale between the death of the self and the possibility of being. Without such acknowledgement, we could feel the rageful blind push, as again Rollo May writes, quote, "The destructive activities of the demonic are only the reverse side of its constructive motivation," end quote. In analysis, the potential space created by inquiry allows for possible change. As Frank Summers notes, quote, "Those unrealized parts of the self are the root of the patient's disturbance. Indeed, it is precisely this gap of non-being that typically motivates treatment," end quote. The space created by the analyst and patient allows the patient to first accept what is, then consider the possibilities of self that have never been. We're almost there, folks. Where psychoanalysis led me to reconsider poetry, it also led me in a roundabout way to a Zen Buddhist practice with a Scottish monk who used to be a boxer. In one of our first exchanges, he answered my question with a response from a koan. Koans being parables or public cases presented to students, and their resolution cannot be hammered out by logic. He said, "Not knowing is most intimate." I didn't understand, and again, like that Lacanian lecture, I was a little angry. But one useful bit the monk said about meditating was, the only way you're doing it wrong is if you're sitting there telling yourself you're doing it wrong. So I kept sitting in meditation, and this folding and unfolding of the self-prescribed supposed to know kept hitting me with each koan. There are no answers, even though there are. You just can't find them through study or memorization. They are to be inhabited, and the answers felt, not found. When the monk throws a koan at me, I could feel the anxiety in my chest. And more often than not, he answers my attempt with, "Not it." So I bow and go sit again. In those rare moments I do get it, and the response appears cleanly and immediately, it's there and gone, and I'm sitting again with myself, not knowing and relieved that not knowing is not terminal. I try to dress decently for work. I put on a jacket and tie, and I've spent enough time dressed to hang sheetrock and drive trucks. So one day, a few years back, I was leaving supervision downtown, and I was generally having a bad time of it. One of my control cases was threatening to leave. I was lost in the classes. Readings were piling up on me. I was really wondering why I was doing this at all. And so I'm going to the subway to head back north to my office. And going down the stairs, I could just hear this horrible screaming, just nonstop ranting, just psychotic gibberish. I get down onto the platform, and the whole crowd is at the far end of the platform, away from as far away as possible they can be from the homeless man who's screaming. I see this and I felt calmer. I felt better. It's like, all right, I have plenty of experience with this. So I just keep walking, go right past the guy. And as I'm walking past him, he stops screaming long enough to almost whisper to me. He says, "That suit's not going to fool anyone." Then he goes back to screaming. It was like a sucker punch. And even he knew. Just as a psychotic person's impossible certainties separate him from the world, my own demand that I was supposed to know also did. Finishing this program, I'm just starting again, circling back and moving forward, learning how to be a psychoanalyst. Finishing was another starting point. And I understand I will never reach the end. And I understand I'm to repeat this pattern of being lost and frustrated and surprised and relieved over and over again. Early on in analysis, I started off a session saying the thing most people say or hear in sessions. I walked in and said, "I don't know if I have anything to talk about today." My analyst smiled and clapped her hands once, said, "Good, now we can really start." Thank you.